from MTN, the Montana Television Network. This is Face the State.
Good morning and welcome to Face the State on the Montana Television Network. I'm Mike Dennison, MTN's chief political reporter. Joining me today on the show are Senator Jennifer Fielder, a Republican from Thompson Falls in the northwestern corner of the state, and Senator Mike Phillips, a Democrat from Bozeman. Today we'll be talking primarily about federal public lands and the debate in Montana and the West on whether those lands can or should be transferred to the states for management purposes. Senator Fielder and Senator Phillips are on the opposite side of this issue, but we're also going to spend some time talking about something the two senators often agree on, and that is the effort to expand the use of local solar power through more net metering. But first, let's start with the main event, public lands. Senator Fielder, you're the CEO of the American Lands Council, and its mission is to transfer federal public lands to willing states, I believe. Tell me what that means and how would that happen and why should it happen?
Well, if we could start by taking a look at the map, I think it gives some context to this discussion because over half of Western America is under control of Washington, D.C. And so we have this great imbalance. Not only is it unfair, it's not working. We have in the red here on the map 50% of all of the western United States under control of Washington, D.C., primarily under control of all those other states to the east that you see. And so we're seeing decisions made out of Washington, D.C. and from those other eastern states that dominate the discussions in D.C. that are affecting the way our public lands are managed here in Montana. And that's affecting our air and our water and our wildlife, our camping, our access to public lands, our economy. And we're seeing those decisions made by people who really don't live here, don't understand these issues, and in some cases don't really care.
We'll get more into the details of some of the reasons why and why not. But first, Senator Phillips, I'm assuming you think this is a kind of a misguided effort and a bad idea. Am I right? And why do you feel that way?
You are right.
Okay.
I would have you believe the map that Senator Fielder just showed is evidence that Americans control those lands. We control, not Washington, D.C. Ours is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. So I'm proud of the fact that Americans own these vast tracts of public lands that serve the country well. They're not controlled by Washington, D.C. Last time I looked, as an example, the employees of the Gallatin National Forest lived in Bozeman. They're local folks too. And I think the notion of having this massive transfer of federal lands to the states is a misguided idea that's tantamount to trying to sell snake oil.
One thing I'd like to address up front, it seems highly unlikely, in fact, almost a political impossibility that we could ever get Congress to approve something like this transfer. So why are we even talking about it? Senator Fielder.
Well, I have faith in the American system of government, and I do believe it's a government of the people, by the people, for the people, and our representatives can influence the decisions that are made. And unfortunately, there's a lot of special interests that influence the decisions in Washington, D.C., and we don't know really what's going on in the back room and in the hallways there too much. We don't have good access to our representatives in Washington, D.C., and Montana only has 3 members out of 535 members of Congress. So even if we had the very best representation there, we really don't have much of a voice. So the idea is that we do want to compel Congress to transfer the lands to the states. They've done it before many times. Montana already manages about 6 million acres of public lands, and many of those acres were transferred from the federal government to the state. So it's a continuation of what's already been done before. And I think the pain is so widespread now that there's popular support growing for this idea that yes, the people in Montana should make the decisions about which trails and campgrounds are open, which timber sales go and which ones don't, and that type of thing. It doesn't make any more sense for Washington, D.C. or representatives in New York to make decisions about our timber sales or our grazing rights than it would for us to be making decisions about how they manage their subway system.
But do you think that...
But Mike, the fact of the matter is Montana does have a big voice in D.C. Every state that has 2 U.S. senators is equally represented in the Senate. We have fewer than 1 million residents. Compare us to California. So Senator Tester and Senator Daines have tremendous opportunity to work on behalf of Montana's individual citizens. Moreover, Jennifer, all of this depends on how you define what ours is. Ours can be the country's forests and how we manage those forests. You can oversimplify this, but the fact is there isn't growing support. We know from countless public surveys across the western United States There is widespread support for the status quo, widespread support for federal lands to remain federal lands. They are the heartthrob of the economic vitality of the western states. Turning those lands over to the states isn't going to ensure economic vitality going forward. As a matter of fact, one could make a strong case that the states, like Montana, can't afford to manage these federal lands. Moreover, if they were transferred to the states, they would be guided against a different set of policies and laws that would maximize, that would insist through legislation that the economic benefits of these public lands transferred to the states would have to be maximized. So all of a sudden, what we end up doing is managing these lands to simply make money. That would run counter to many of the desires of Western citizens and the country at large.
Although that's what the state does with the state lands.
That's exactly the point, Mike. So imagine all of these federal lands are transferred to the state, and by law the state would have to maximize the economic benefits to fund public schools. So forget a multiple use mandate, forget fishing and hunting and hiking ranking high compared to extractive activities that might make some economic sense short term. I don't think the states can afford it, and I think it would upend our whole notion about this idea of public ownership and public use.
We'll come back to that in a second. But would you like to answer Senator Phillips on some of the things that he's positing out there, the way things are?
I would. You know, there's been some polls done that are push polls that say, do you want to keep public lands public? And of course, the majority of people do. I do. But it's not the question of keeping public lands question. The question is, do you want to keep public lands under federal control, or do you want to transfer the public lands to Montana control? And I'd like to see Montanans be in charge of those decisions, because I think it'll be a higher priority for us to manage our public lands better. We care about our public lands and our environment and our air and our water and our wildlife far more than someone who doesn't live here does.
Yeah,
Getting back to the realistic of whether this really happened, I have a similar question for you as I asked Senator Fielder, and that is, let's assume this is a high improbability this is going to happen, transferring these lands to the states. Then why are Democrats and public land advocates bothering to sort of demagogue this issue and say that they're going to be sold off and saying all these terrible things are going to happen, when in reality, it's not going to happen?
Well, first, I don't think the response has been demagoguery. I think the response has been fact-based, and the response has been, here's a likely outcome of transfers, and the outcome is not an attractive one. But on this notion, why would someone like myself care? As I reviewed material for this show, I thought to myself, why am I spending my time on this issue? It simply represents a dog that will not hunt. I don't think this issue is going anywhere. It's not rooted to firm legal footing. It's not rooted to firm footing that speaks to the desires of Montanans or Coloradans or Idahoans or anyone else that lives in the western United States. Forget the rest of the country east of the Mississippi River, for example. I have said in my own political circles, we should let, from a partisan perspective, and I'm not an especially partisan politician, but nonetheless, I've said we should let the Republicans push this forward because it plays well for Democrats, because Montanans do not support transfer.
Let's talk about you brought up the legal question, and first let's show that graphic we have of the Enabling Act, the language in there. This is the act that that made Montana become a state, and within that there's some language right here that says that the people inhabiting said proposed states do agree and declare that they forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated public lands lying within the boundaries thereof. Senator Fielder, you're well aware of that, and there's other language too.
Yeah, and there's no period there. It goes on, the sentence goes on and says, until title thereto shall have been extinguished. And there was an expectation, and there still is an expectation, that the federal government would relinquish control over the land inside of our states. You can go back to a whole pile of records, of documents, political records, congressional records. The U.S. Constitution annotated itself, says that Congress shall only temporarily deprive the states control over the public lands. And it's already been done before. And that same language that you just showed that's in the Montana Enabling Act is also in the Enabling Acts to the east of the Rocky Mountains. In fact, North Dakota and Montana were brought into statehood under the same exact Enabling Act, the same document that you just excerpted. And yet North Dakota has control over their lands, and still we've got 29 million acres of Montana under control of Washington, D.C.
But doesn't that language still say that Congress has the power to decide whether that land should be transferred to the state?
Absolutely it does, and that's my point. And when people say this is unlawful, it's crazy, because Congress does have the power to transfer the public lands to the state. It's Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution grants them that power to do that. And so that's what we're working on. We're working on trying to educate people about why this matters, why it's important, and we are seeing growing popular support for this issue. The more that we're able to get a fact-based discussion on the table about it, the more we're seeing people go, wow, this just doesn't make sense. That's why we're seeing eastern states now passing resolutions of support for western lands getting their, or western states getting their lands back.
Now, I have a question for you, Senator Phillips. One of the reasons for this movement, I think, is the frustration on the parts of people living in rural parts of Montana and other western states who may favor a mine or logging or other perfectly legal activity that could provide good jobs. And yet under federal management, these activities are increasingly slowed or stymied. Isn't that a problem? And wouldn't state control perhaps help resolve that problem?
Yeah, you know,
still
Mike,
provide good management.
Sure. It's not necessarily federal management that stymies the hope for activities. It's typically lawsuits. That in this country we hold in high regard this right to seek redress in court. So you can't criticize neighbors for saying, I don't think that's the appropriate use of this public resource, so I'm going to move my grievance to court. That's a long-held American right, to seek redress in court. Moreover, why do you think that these conflicts would go away if there were state control of the lands? They would still drive the conflict to court, but now it wouldn't be the federal government sitting there, it'd be the state government sitting there. Moreover, we know that you oversimplify, Mike, if you say that these vast tracts of federal lands are hindering economic activity. We know from good studies done by a host of groups, nonpartisan groups, one here in Bozeman, the Headwaters Economics Group, that show quite clearly that vast tracts of federal land are an important part of the economic vitality of much of the western United States. That large tracts of federal land ensure good employment, ensure good economic growth, good wage growth. These data are clear. Just take Bozeman for a moment. A big part of the sweet spot that is Bozeman is the fact that it's close to vast acres of federal lands. Federal lands that draw people to this region for a host of reasons, to live or to recreate. Federal lands are an important part of the economic vitality of these western communities. That may not be the case if they're held under state control, because the state is guided by different policies. For example, state governments have to balance their budgets. So if all of a sudden the state of Montana came to control millions and millions of acres of federal land, how do they control it? How do they pay for that? How do they pay for that control? They've got to balance the budget. They've got to make money off state lands. What you would almost undoubtedly see is a significant increase in extractive activities that would in turn compromise the other uses of these same lands.
Now that's one view.
It's like a great big balloon, man. You push it on one side, it's going to pop out on the other.
Yeah.
There is no free lunch.
Senator Fielder, do you agree that the same conflicts would still exist under state control that we were talking about? You know, Senator Phillips said there's still going to be lawsuits, there's still going to be tying things up. Do you agree?
Not really, because it's the federal policies that are so convoluted that even the federal agencies have a hard time following them. So when they are sued, they're losing often because they can't follow their own laws, because the regulations are a mile high. Montana doesn't have that issue with our public lands. We're able to manage our public lands effectively. We have about 6 million acres. We manage them effectively, and you see relatively few lawsuits affecting state management of public lands. We're actually able to go in and manage the timber to reduce fire hazards, and that saves us a lot of money. You can save so much money by going in and managing the timber responsibly. You can also produce more water coming out of your watersheds to serve your communities. So you prevent those wildfires rather than wait until they light and then watch them burn and then pay the consequences afterwards. Montana does a great job of fighting fires on most of the state. We take care of the fires on 70% of Montana, and we have a history of putting them out before they get to 10 acres in size. And the federal government doesn't. I mean, we're seeing off the chart record catastrophic fires now because we have so much timber out there that's so thick and so overgrown, it's choking itself out. And once a fire gets going in there, you're seeing these fires take off and they can't be controlled. And the worst part about it is that Montana last summer was ready to put these fires out when they were little tiny lightning starts. You had these little puff balls, and our helicopters are up in the air ready to put those fires out. And the Fed said, no, you can't put out the fires on our land because your helicopters aren't on our list of approved equipment. So our guys had to stand down and watch thousands of acres, tens of thousands of acres of our forest burn up, and we had to see wildlife burned up by the thousands. Our communities were evacuated, our air was polluted, the smoke was so thick that the streetlights were coming on in the middle of the day, and that's carcinogenic pollution that we're all breathing for weeks and weeks on end. A lot of that could have been stopped if it weren't for some silly little federal regulation that said, no, your helicopters aren't on our list, so therefore, you know, you can't go put the fires out, and we're going to wait and order equipment from hours and hours away, and by then it's too late.
So there's a lot of things I'm sure you want to talk about there, but before you do that, in answering Senator Fielder on some of the things you said, first I want to ask you, why couldn't the state manage these lands? I mean, of course, we'd have to finance in some way, but as she mentioned, the state does manage 6 million acres of land right now and does it fairly well. They cut timber at a legally mandated amount, and no one raises the big stink about it. Why couldn't we manage our state lands?
Well,
our public lands.
You glossed over the central issue. We'd have to figure out how to pay for it.
Right.
That is not an inconsequential amount of money. Senator Fielder made a good point about Montana's abilities to fight fire. Much of that ability is financed by the federal government. Imagine that Montana had to pay for all the firefighting on our own. It would break our back. So just the fact of the matter is we can't afford it in the state of Montana. We simply can't afford it in the state of Montana. And I would have you believe that if it's just a silly little regulation that kept those helicopters out of the air, well, let's fix that silly little regulation. That would seem to me a far more practical approach than trying to get a congressional action that is as profound as affecting the massive transfer of federal lands to the states across the western U.S. Nobody would argue that federal lands can't be managed better. The feds would argue they can manage their lands better. Congress has a habit of underfunding these federal land management agencies, Forest Service, BLM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, etc. Moreover, I've sat on, for over a decade now, I've sat on the House Fish and Game Committee and the Senate Fish and Game Committee. Senator Fielder and I sat for a short period of time on the Senate committee together. It's constant that we hear the state of Montana is not managing their lands well. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks doesn't manage our wildlife management areas well. People are more than willing to criticize the state of Montana over its ability to manage its rather modest holdings. Imagine for a moment that those holdings now included tens of millions of more acres. Imagine how many people would troop in to the Senate Fish and Game Committee and the Senate Natural Resources Committee and grouse about mismanagement by the state of Montana. This isn't, nobody can debate that the lands could be better managed. Yeah. The question is, who's best suited to manage these lands? Who's best suited to pay? And I believe that the best suit comes from a collective endeavor involving state and federal agencies working together on behalf of local communities, regional communities, and the country at large.
Well, let's talk about the money, which I was going to ask about as well. Of course, the northern region budget is like $300 million. That's just for the forest, the BLM lands. We have forest fires. We do have to pay for it all. Isn't that a legitimate concern that we're not going to be able to afford to do all these things?
Well, if we manage the public lands the same way the federal government does, of course we couldn't afford to do it. They are mismanaging and it's inefficient. We're seeing so much waste. We're seeing so little of the federal money actually get on the ground to do the job, and I know federal land managers are frustrated by that. I mean, as little as 10% of the budget in some ranger districts actually goes to the resource and managing the resource that they're entrusted to manage. 80 to 90% of the federal budget is spent either fighting wildfires after they start or fighting lawsuits, fighting and preparing for litigation. So very little of the money is actually getting onto the ground. The state can manage more efficiently because we won't have to deal with that mass of silly regulations, and that was that no helicopters putting out the fires was just one of many, many. It's an endless sea of these silly regulations that create management roadblocks to actually doing what is right. And Montana manages our lands we outperform the feds by about 15 to 1 on average when it comes to economics.
Let's.
I haven't seen those data, but there's some great stuff here. You can.
Yeah, well, we're going to turn to net metering in just a minute. Before we do that, though, each of you, let's just say one brief thing about public lands as to where this issue is going and whether it should be going at all. Let's start with you, Senator Fielder.
I think we all want healthy air, water, and wildlife, and we want abundant outdoor recreation and safe, vibrant communities, but we're not seeing that under federal control. We're seeing just the opposite in many, many cases. So the idea is to free these lands from federal bureaucracies that are controlled thousands of miles away and put those decisions in the hands of the people that are here in Montana. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I don't think it's going anywhere. I think a better approach is to promote collaboration between state and federal agencies to ensure we're doing the best job with management possible. I would posit that if this transfer goes forward, because the cost will be so burdensome, what you'll see, Mike, is much of this federal land transferred to the states is in turn sold to private individuals. And so all of a sudden, the great opportunity provided by our public lands is much diminished because they're owned by really rich people that say, you're not welcome.
Although Democrats voted against bills from Senator Fielder that would have prohibited that.
That's
Well,
right.
we were voting, I was voting against the general concept.
Okay.
And I'm not about, as Jennifer knows, I'm not inclined to try to fix a bad bill.
You're
What
saying
I'm
that
inclined to do is
Montana,
to stop a bad bill in its tracks.
what you're saying is Montana representatives would vote to sell off all of Montana's public lands. Does that make any sense? I don't know anybody in Montana that would vote that way.
Sure. What I know is that eventually the pressure to make the budget balanced would be so great, the state would be compelled to sell some of these lands that did not have obvious economic activity in an extractive sense.
I think they can be an economic benefit to our state. I know they can. They have for 100 years.
I'm not doubting that. I'm saying that it's not enough to cover the entire bill, and consequently, to make the state whole, you sell land.
I wouldn't.
Okay. Okay.
That's great. On that point, Jennifer and I agree. And
Yeah,
that's a matter-
you'll agree on that, and then we'll also talk about net metering a little bit. We should agree as well. First of all, let's tell our audience what net metering is, how it works, and how it can help people who want to have electric power generation at their home or the business or the neighborhood. So who wants to go ahead?
Oh, yeah, sure. It's not a complicated concept, really. If you generate your own power in excess of your need, you can send that power back into the line, and Northwestern Energy's got to pay you for it.
And generate it with a solar system or a wind system.
Any system
Yeah,
that
any
you
system
choose to
want.
use. Typically it's renewable, typically it's solar. You're generating power in excess of your needs, so you turn around and sell it to Northwestern Energy, which is a regulated utility. So they're required to do some things per state law. And one of those things they're required to do is buy that energy. It's an efficient system because typically they buy the energy from you and it goes right to your neighbor. So those electrons follow the path of least resistance to the most immediate use. That's all net metering means. I generate power in excess of my needs, I get paid for it.
Now, Senator Fielder, let's talk about the bill that you sponsored at the last legislature that was aggregate net metering. What did that do, and why were you trying to get that passed?
Great bill, by the way.
Thank you. Well, it's my understanding that the power company doesn't really pay you for the power, but they give you a credit on your bill. So your electricity bill can be reduced by the amount of excess power that you produce. It's already allowed in Montana. Every property can connect to the grid with 1 meter on the property. But in the case where you've got multiple meters on the same piece of land, the bill that I carried would have allowed a landowner to have 2 or more meters that would be connected to the grid. So for example, a farmer that's got a meter at the house and runs the electricity off the house, he might have a meter out a few 100 feet or actually hundreds of yards, maybe even miles away where his well is. And it's the same parcel of land, it's the same landowner. And this would just allow both of those meters to be connected to the grid so they could get credit on whichever meter was spinning backwards and basically producing more power than they were using.
And Senator Phillips, you had a neighborhood net metering bill. What
Yes.
would that have done?
It would have allowed communities like Bozeman, for example, individuals to come together as a neighborhood and invest in a system that could generate safe, reliable, affordable energy in excess of their needs, and they would see a reduced bill from Northwestern Energy as well. The way it's set up right now, individuals have to go it alone. And it struck me as decidedly Montanan that we would come together and go forward as a neighborhood. That's the idea behind community net metering. Combined with Senator Fielder's bill, we were trying to make the whole notion of net metering more useful to Montanans, to promote the generation of affordable, reliable, renewable, clean energy. I fail to see how anybody can argue with that. Now, Northwestern Energy did. They put forth a full court press to kill Senator Fielder's bill, to kill my bill, and 2 other companion bills that were moved in the Montana House, including one by Representative Whittick, another colleague of ours. And I think, simply put, they were in staunch opposition to the bills because the whole notion of energy independence upsets their business model. And I would hope that with time, Northwestern Energy will come to realize that the energy future will include distributed generation. So the notion of having a big company that generates electricity at these central power plants and then sends it out over these wires that go thousands of miles connected to wooden poles, that old model is going to be replaced by a new model that speaks to distributed generation. Home solar panels, for example.
So we have liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, some of whom are for this idea, and I think consumers like it. Why can't you get it passed? What's standing in the way, and how do you get around well, the opposition from the utilities?
Yeah, well, let me see.
Two things.
It was good, smart Montanans. Good, smart Montanans coming together. Yeah. Not liberals, not conservatives, not Democrats, not good, common sense Montanans coming together.
Yeah, so I think there's 2 things that were really blocking it. One is the net metering community refused to budge, and the other one is the energy companies refused to budge. And so the net metering proponents wanted that credit for the power that's produced to be 1-to-1. They didn't want to allow the company to buy it at a discounted rate, which makes some sense to me, that the company wouldn't have to pay full price for that power, that maybe they get it at a discount, and then it makes sense to their business model. And on the other hand, Northwestern Energy said we have a zero tolerance policy for this issue. We're just not 1 inch. We're not going to budge. So that's what we're seeing, and I'm hoping that those different entities will work together in the off season and come up with a compromise solution. I think it's really important for Montanans to be able to be self-reliant, to be able to produce their own power, their own water, grow their own food. The more self-reliant you are as a family, the better you are able to take care of yourself, regardless of what goes on with outside forces. And if you're able to take care of yourself, you're in a better situation to help take care of others too if they need it.
And I can't add anything to that. That's a beautiful expression of the intent of those bills.
And now one of the arguments we hear from the utility a lot is that if we allow more net metering on a larger scale, it's actually going to cost other customers within the system.
Yeah, right. That's true.
I mean, do you think that's true?
No, that's true. At a certain point of market penetration, the logic is sound. Montana is an order of magnitude below that. Net metering would have to become an order of magnitude more common for net metered customers to be taking advantage of their neighbors. So we said, and it's already in existing code that authorizes the activities of the Public Service Commission, when we reach that point, the Public Service Commission can step in and apply fees that address that problem. That option wasn't good enough for Northwestern Energy. You should have them here, asking them the tough questions, because I found their opposition to be irrational.
Well, that's something we do plan to do in the future with some of our coverage. And we've come to the close of our show. I've been talking with Senator Jennifer Fielder from Thompson Falls, Senator Mike Phillips from Bozeman, about the issues of public lands and whether they should be managed by the state or the federal government. We've also been talking about net metering as well. Join us next time. We'll be talking about coal and renewable power on Face the State. Thanks for joining us.
You've been watching Face the State, a presentation of MTN, the Montana Television Network.